Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam, Hilchos Naziris, Perik Beis, Halacha Tezayin. The Rambam rules as follows. Hagoyim ein lahem Nazirus. A non-Jew does not have the laws of Nazirus. Shenemar, as it says, Daber al Bnei Yisrael. Speak to the Bnei Yisrael, which excludes anyone who's not Bnei Yisrael from being a Nazir. In other words, if a non-Jew makes a vow that he should become a Nazir, he's not subject to the laws concerning a Nazir. Now, Rashi, explaining the Gemara, that the Mishnah that says this, says, Ha'akum shenadru b'nazirus ein nazirus chala aleihen, u'mitarin l'galach v'lishtas yayim v'litami l'mesim. That a non-Jew who makes a vow to become a Nazir doesn't have any effect on him, and he's allowed to shave his hair, to drink wine, and become contaminated by coming in contact with the dead. Tosfos says that when it says that they have no Nazirus, it means they don't have a korban, a sacrifice that goes along with a Nazir. So even though a non-Jew could accept upon himself to bring a sacrifice, generally speaking, Nidarim b'Nedavis, voluntary offerings, but when it comes to a Nazir who has to bring the offerings, that is not something that a non-Jew would have to bring. Now, why doesn't Rashi learn like Tosfos? So the Rebbe explains, because, very simply, because there's no chiddush, there's nothing novel to say that a non-Jew is not subject to the restrictions of a Nazir. Why should you think that he should be subject to that? They don't have the laws of Nidarim, of vows. That's what Tosfos says. No, it has to do with the korban, because non-Jews do have a role in bringing sacrifices to the Beis HaMikdash. So here we have to learn that no, in this case, the sacrifices of a Nazir do not apply. So the question the Rebbe asks on Rashi is, why do we have to take a pasuk, a biblical verse, to teach you that a non-Jew is not obligated to follow the laws of Nazirus, even if he makes such a vow? Why would you think otherwise? Why would you think that he is subject? This is a question the Keren Eira, one of the commentaries on the Gemara in Nazir, asks, why would we need a pasuk to tell you that he's excluded? No, Tosfos doesn't use it for that reason, that he's excluded from the laws of Nazirus. It's just that he's excluded from the laws of the korban associated with a Nazir. But to say that he doesn't have any obligation to not cut his hair and not become contaminated to the touching a dead body and not to drink wine, that's obvious. And a question on the Rambam himself, the Rambam doesn't mention anything about that he's not subject to any of these laws. He just says that the laws of Nazirus only apply to a Bnei Yisrael. Why doesn't he add that he doesn't have to refrain from drinking wine, he doesn't have to refrain from cutting his hair, he doesn't have to refrain from coming into contact with the dead? So the Rebbe in Likutei Sichos explains as follows. He says, we find that even before the Torah was given, we find the Torah discusses shavua, oaths and vows. For example, Avimelech makes a vow. Why would he have to keep his vow? There's no obligation to keep a vow in the 7 Noahide commandments. The Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noah don't include keeping what you swear, make a vow that you will do. The Mishnah Melech explains that it could be that it's included in the mitzvah of Birkas Hashem. One of the 7 mitzvahs is not to speak sacrilegiously, cursing the Almighty. So in some remote way, not violating your oath could be considered an affront to God. But that's very difficult. The Rebbe says, where does he get that from? Where does it say anywhere that not keeping a shavua is tantamount to a curse of Hashem? So the Rebbe explains as follows. There's a sefer called Cheskuni, one of the Rishonim, who explains why was the generation of the flood punished. They didn't have the mitzvahs. They were not given the obligation, so why were they punished? So he says there are certain mitzvahs that you're obligated to keep based on logic, compelling logic, even though they're not commanded. That means that in addition to the 7 Noahide commandments, a Ben Noach is obligated because it's logically compelling. And we find also Reb Nissen Gaon in his introduction to Masechta Brachas. He says, Kol ha-mitzvah shehin tluyin b'svara u'v'nisana deliba var ha-kol mischayvim behen min hayem shabar elikim adam al ha'aretz olam v'lazar achel v'derid That any mitzvah that's based on logic was already we're already subject to fulfill them, and this applied from the day that man was created and for all eternity. So the Rebbe therefore says that it could be that the observance of your vocal pronouncements that you're going to do such and such, you make an oath, is included in something that is based on logic, compelling logic, even though it's not one of the 7 commandments. And the Rebbe says support for this, we find there's a certain thing called mishapara. If a person makes a commitment and doesn't keep it, in certain cases, he has to accept upon himself the recitation of mishapara. What is mishapara? Mishapara ma'anshadar hamabel, whoever exacted punishment from the people of the generation of the flood, and Wadar hafloga, the generation of the Tower of Bavel, will also punish someone who doesn't stand by his word. Even though in Torah you can retract your word, your commitment, and you're not violating anything biblically, but not only is it not immoral, proper behavior, but moreover, this is comparable to what the people of the generation of the flood and the generation of the Tower of Babel did. So from this we understand that Ben Noach, it is also forbidden to go back on his word when he makes a vow, because it's based on logic, and not just in matters that are being adam l'chaverei, between one person and another, but also when it's things between a person and God. Keeping your utterances of your mouth is a behavior that logic dictates, either whether you make a commitment to your fellow or you make a commitment to God. And the same thing is true about Shavuos and Nedarim of Bnei Noach, even though they're not included in the general biblical prohibition of Bal Yachal, not transgressing, not profaning your words. They don't have that specific biblical commandment, but they do have a commandment because of the logic that dictates that you should keep that which comes out of your mouth. So the Rebbe says that there will be some practical differences between the way Ben Noach has to observe and keep the utterances of his mouth and the way Ben Yisrael does. The fact that a non-Jew is excluded from Nazirus, it means he's excluded from the Nazirus that the Torah speaks about, which applies to a Yisrael. But the concept of making a vow, that if he makes a vow that he's going to separate himself and not drink wine or not shave his hair, he has to keep that. So why does Rashi say then that he doesn't have to keep these things? So the Rebbe explains that there's a difference how the non-Jew accepts upon himself Nazirus. If he says, Hareini Nazir ki Yisrael, I'm a Nazir like a Jew makes a vow to be a Nazir. Or even if he just says it without adding the word Yisrael, it's obvious that he's referring to a Nazir, which is a concept in the Torah that applies to a Jewish person. He doesn't have the law. He doesn't have the obligation. Why? Because the laws of Nazir were written to Bnei Yisrael. But if he says, I'm a Nazir min ataglachas, he specifies one behavior. I'm a Nazir in the sense that I'm not going to shave my hair, or min hayayim, I'm not going to drink any wine, and the like, where he's explicitly saying what he won't do, not just he's a Nazir. He's saying he's not going to drink wine, he's not going to cut his hair. That he has to keep because of logic that dictates so. And that explains, the Rebbe says, why the Rambam doesn't tell you that a Ben Noach doesn't have to observe the law, the restriction of drinking wine and cutting his hair and becoming tummy to the Mesim, even if he makes a vow to be a Nazir, because you can't make that unequivocal statement. Why? Because on one hand, if he says, I want to be a Nazir, just be a Nazir stam without explaining, specifying what kind of restrictions he's going to accept upon himself. In that case, he's not a Nazir, because a Nazir is a subject that applies to a Ben Yisrael, not to a Ben Noach. But if he makes a restriction, he specifies the wine or the hair or the coming in contact with the dead, then he's subject to that, because that is something that he has an obligation to do. So the Rambam can't say that he doesn't have to do these things, because it depends on how he phrases his vow. And that explains why the Torah has to specifically exclude a Ben Noach from being a Nazir, because logic dictates that you have to keep your vow. So the Torah says, no, if he says that I want to be a Nazir, I want to be a Nazir like a Yisrael, or just I want to accept the concept of the Torah that speaks about Nazir, that doesn't apply to him. If he wants to make a vow to restrict himself from wine and so on, for that he could do. So that's why the Torah has to say, you would think maybe the laws of Nazir do apply because of the logic. So the Torah says, no, they don't apply.